Does the UK need a nuclear deterrent? British MPs have thrown their support behind the renewal of the Trident nuclear weapons programme. But is this kind of system still relevant, and can nuclear power really protect the world's superpowers? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. British politicians have voted on an issue that will have a profound impact on the future of the country's security. They've overwhelmingly voted to renew the Trident nuclear weapons system. Britain's nuclear submarines are expected to be decommissioned sometime after the year 2030. And for the past 10 years, there's been debate over what should replace them. New Prime Minister Theresa May has said that she wouldn't hesitate to launch a nuclear strike, and that Trident is a crucial pillar of the UK's security. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Barnaby Phillips sets up our discussion from Westminster.
A new Prime Minister in the famous Old Chamber. Theresa May speaking for the first time as leader of the government in Parliament, and on her willingness to use nuclear weapons, revealing a steely sense of purpose.
We must continually convince any potential aggressors that the benefits of an attack on Britain are far outweighed by their consequences, and we cannot afford to relax our guard or rule out further shifts which would put our country in grave danger.
The opposition Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn is equally firm in his convictions that he would never use nuclear weapons. A principled position perhaps, although most of his own colleagues in Parliament disagree with him.
I make it clear today that I would not take a decision that kills millions of innocent people. I do not believe the threat of mass murder is a legitimate way to go about dealing with international relations.
Britain's Trident nuclear missiles, made in the United States, are kept on 4 submarines, at least one of which is always armed and at sea. The idea is that if Britain were hit in a nuclear attack, a submarine could fire back. And so, despite the protests outside, the chilling logic of mutually assured destruction still with us, more than a quarter of a century after the end of the Cold War.
Order!
The vote itself was a formality. The government's majority and the support of most Labour MPs easily enough to ensure victory and a renewal of the Trident weapons system. Theresa May hopes that this vote will send a message to Britain's allies, all of which were so disappointed by the Brexit vote. She argues that Britain is still an outward-looking country, a major military power, prepared to take on international responsibilities in a dangerous and unpredictable world. Barnaby Phillips, Al Jazeera, Westminster in central London.
Well, there are 3 parts to the Trident weapons system, including submarines, missiles and warheads. Britain has, as you heard, 4 submarines that each carry up to 8 Trident missiles. And each of those missiles can be fitted with a number of nuclear warheads that can be aimed at different targets. Work started on renewing the Trident fleet back in 2007, but was delayed due to rising costs. It's now estimated that it will cost at least $41 billion to replace the 4 submarines. As always, lots to talk about on today's programme. Let's bring in our guests for the discussion. From London, we're joined by Paul Ingram, Executive Director of the British-American Security Information Council. From Washington, Doug Bandow, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. And also from London, Grant Christopher, Research Assistant at the International Centre for Security Analysis at King's College London. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Before we get into the wider discussion here, I just want to spend a few minutes concentrating on Prime Minister Theresa May's assertion that she would be willing to authorise a strike that could kill 100,000 people. Paul, what do you make of that assertion? What would you have made of it if it had come from, for instance, India's Prime Minister, Pakistan's Prime Minister?
Well, it is an essential part of nuclear deterrence that you are prepared to use it. There is no point in possessing nuclear weapons if you're not prepared to launch them. Having said that, what was particularly worrying was the way in which the Prime Minister was so quick to say, yes, I would be prepared to launch without any hesitation. And it's that hesitation that is absolutely required when these warheads are so devastating, and the use of them would trigger such an enormous exchange of nuclear weapons that we have to hesitate. And it has only been people's willingness to hesitate in similar circumstances in the past that has saved us from nuclear war.
Doug, are there double standards at play here? Just because it was the UK's Prime Minister, if it had been the President of the United States who'd said that so emphatically, does that make it okay?
Well, I think clearly, as the other guest indicated, the critical question is, deterrence, does it work? You have to indicate your willingness to use them. I think that any politician who wants to have an effective nuclear deterrent has to make that obvious. I think the difference is that the U.S. is the dominant military power that goes to war so often. Nobody really doubts the willingness of the American president to make war. They probably don't doubt the willingness then to use nuclear weapons. And I suspect they might not doubt it for, say, Pakistan, because they view Pakistan and India have gone to war before, so they'd probably be willing to do so, in a way that the UK, not having that kind of a reputation, and as a new Prime Minister, she may feel at least some need to try to assert herself, and that may be influencing her in this case.
Grant, how are people in the rest of the world meant to feel about what they heard in the British Parliament yesterday, Mrs May's assertion? People in non-nuclear armed states, do you think they feel any safer after Mrs May's decisive yes?
Yes and no. She isn't talking to them. That wasn't really the audience for this comment. The audience was aimed domestically in the UK. This was a domestic debate between parliamentarians in the UK. Maybe she's talking to leaders and policymakers in Russia as well. But if you're not in a nuclear armed state, which over half the world, well, roughly half the world is, then most nuclear postures, the guidance that most countries give on when they would use nuclear weapons actually completely exclude states that are not nuclear armed anyway.
Paul, I saw you grinning there at something you heard. You want to tell me why?
Yes, because actually you can't in this modern day speak to any particular audience. I think the rest of the world sees Britain making this decision and sees the hypocrisy behind it, that a country in the safest corner of the safest continent can still rely upon the threat of the use of massive weapons of mass destruction when states in far more precarious security situations are told that they must do without. This is not lost amongst the people in Iran, nor is it lost in Saudi Arabia. And I think we all have a responsibility to pay particular attention to what these decisions look like from other parts of the world. All of us have an interest in ensuring that nuclear weapons do not spread. The only way of preventing that is to engage far more seriously in nuclear disarmament efforts and to be more cautious about investing in these systems for indefinite periods of time. The debate yesterday demonstrates that Britain has no intention in the near or medium term to get rid of its nuclear arsenal, and that is the message that will be received across the world.
Doug, I want to pick up on something Paul was saying a little earlier about whether nuclear deterrence actually works. It might work today. I suppose that's debatable. Will it continue to work in the future?
Well, I think so, though, again, you're primarily using it in theory, at least, against a potential nuclear threat against you. Those are fairly rare. I mean, at the moment, I don't see a lot of powers interested in using nuclear weapons against each other. I think the argument from the UK standpoint is, does it want to rely upon the United States to the extent that it is worried about a country, say Russia? I mean, the only country I can imagine at the moment would be Russia. And I think the issue of extended deterrence, as we call it, will become a more important one in the future, because the United States implicitly, at least, has guaranteed Europe, has guaranteed Asian allies like South Korea and Japan a willingness to use nuclear weapons to defend them. That conceivably could change in the future, depending upon America's security interest, its budget interest. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, has talked about this issue on Asia. We don't know how seriously. I don't think he's going to be president, but if he was, you could see a debate that might have some impact there, and I think it would have an impact on the Europeans as well as Asians.
OK, that answer, Doug, I feel is going to set the course for the rest of our discussion here. I just want to know, Doug, how independent Britain's nuclear deterrent actually is. You're talking about the US there. Does the veto have, does the US rather have a veto or any ability to interfere with the UK's nuclear weapons?
Well, I think the U.S. would be very hesitant to try to physically interfere. I think certainly there would be discussions between the two countries if a circumstance ever arose, because they're so closely linked on defense. And again, it's hard for me to imagine what the contingency would be other than Russia. If Russia was the contingency, presumably America would be involved. So it's hard to answer that, I think, in practice. I have trouble imagining decision-making being made entirely separately by both countries. In theory, it could be, but I have trouble seeing the circumstances where it would be.
OK, we'll come back to the issue you raised a moment ago in just a moment. One more question on the technical side of things first to Grant Christopher. Grant, is Trident outdated? Is it a relic of the Cold War? And if it's not outdated at the moment, how long before technology, which advances at a frightening pace, renders it obsolete?
So nuclear weapons themselves are 70 years old. The Trident missile is much newer, the delivery system. The submarine will be new, that was just footed on. But there is nothing that renders the missile obsolete. There is no good system to counteract a ballistic missile. The submarines themselves, there are questions about anti-submarine warfare, so undersea drones, other things like that were raised in the debate. I would definitely urge caution on saying that these would make submarines detectable anytime soon, as there are countermeasures available to these kinds of things that could be developed. So Trident very much is not obsolete as a technology. It's shouldn't be compared to cavalry or bayonets or anything like that.
Paul Ingram, what do you make of that?
Well, speaking as one of the sources of this aspect of the debate on vulnerabilities to Trident, I can say that I've spoken to many scientists who hold a contrary view, scientists involved in civil and military applications that demonstrate that the technology is well advanced into being able to detect submarines in the open ocean. Look, there's a deeper issue here, which is whether nuclear weapons themselves are technologically obsolete, because the trends in military technology are certainly going towards more smart, smaller, networked, autonomous systems that are cheap and disposable and that communicate in effective ways. That's not only in terms of detecting submarines, but it's in terms of smart impacts. And these submarines that the Parliament gave its endorsement to yesterday will be using technology that is already out of date today, in the sense that the designs were created a good 7 or 8 years ago. They will be facing technology that is up to the minute in 2030, 20 years from now. Your smartphone in your pocket already has far superior processing capabilities than the processing capabilities of the most sophisticated US fighter aircraft. This technology is already immediately changing the dynamics of not only the platforms but of nuclear weapons themselves. Why bother using nuclear weapons when you can bring your opponent's economy to a standstill using cyber warfare? It doesn't stack up that nuclear weapons that are ancient technology way back in the Cold War will be relevant even when these first submarines first hit the water 20 years from now. I would urge any other nation to be looking to leapfrog beyond this technology if they're looking to be relevant in the 21st century.
Grant, I see you nodding there.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I think there's a big question about if the UK pays for Trident, which it looks like it's going to, could it afford all these other systems of developing these other systems? And it would then have a gap in its military capabilities. So in this question, we could force Trident to be obsolete just because it costs so much money. It's not obsolete in the sense that it has a different capability to the other systems being described. So it can't do the things, the cyber attacks and the economic sanction measures that were being talked about, but it can still annihilate cities, and somebody developing a weapon that is based on 1945 technology can still use that weapon to kill hundreds of thousands, millions of people.
Doug, what do you make of what you've heard? Trident's a second strike weapon, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what that means. Perhaps you could explain it. Does it mean that it would only be used if the UK had already suffered a nuclear attack?
Yeah, I can't imagine it being used offensively. The idea of, I mean, yeah, that's right. Of submarine-based missiles is a theory that they're very hard to find, so they would survive. The land-based missiles are theoretically more vulnerable to a first strike. The idea is if you have even a few survive, that no aggressor out there would want to risk losing major cities in a response. I mean, nuclear weapons are the ultimate defender against kind of existential threat. The challenge, of course, is they're expensive, and we live in a world of competing resources, limited resources. You have to decide what it's worth. Only the UK can make that decision. In a world where other countries have nuclear weapons, there is a pressure, I think, on major states to have their own countervailing nuclear weapons, and to some degree, I suspect, that is felt in London.
Doug, what about the risk of miscalculation, of error, of accident? I mean, how close has the world come to disaster in the past? Is it ever possible with nuclear weapons to eliminate the risk?
Well, I don't see how. I mean, we're dealing with human beings. I mean, there was a famous case with Russians where they mistook, they thought there might be an American attack, and thankfully a Russian officer along the way recognized this was not likely to happen. I mean, it's a frightening possibility. I mean, you try to build everything into systems. I had a friend he was in the Air Force. He was a nuclear launch officer. He was one of two officers. Both of them had to simultaneously act to launch a missile. They were beyond arm's reach of each other. Nevertheless, you look at this, any kind of a system, there can be a breakdown, and that's what makes it so scary, is that it's not just kind of an evil person. It's a question of a mistake. It's an error that can happen, and that would be horrific.
Grant, who is it that the UK wants to deter?
So officially, we don't name anyone. So there's in the Strategic Defence Review published last year, we don't outline specific countries, but if you look at the map and look at capabilities, today it's Russia. In 20 years' time, or in 2030, it might be other countries. So North Korea is increasing its range to the continental United States, supposedly. Chinese range might increase. They're going for an open, a blue water navy. Then there's other nuclear armed countries which aren't necessarily hostile to us, like Israel, India, and Pakistan, but things change over the course of 50, 30, 40 years.
Paul, Mohammed al-Baradei, who knows a thing or two about matters nuclear, tweeted today that if the UK views nuclear weapons as the ultimate safeguard for its security, should other nations view them the same way? He said that's a toxic view. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think there are things that other nations can look to Britain to provide some sort of a leadership for, certainly in the past, and I hope to continue in the future, but this is not one of them. As I hinted at earlier, I think the rational response is not to do the same irrational thing that the British are doing. These, as I say, are weapon systems that may have had some relevance in the past, but in the future there is no relevance. It will be far more cost-effective and effective militarily to invest in other systems should you choose to see your security based on military capability. See, the problem with your previous question is that if you look out there across the world, you will always find threats and capabilities. And if you look for threats, you will find them, and you will then justify the military technologies. But if you find other ways of relating to states, if you build international institutions which states can buy into, then you don't even need the military capabilities that I'm advocating, let alone the nuclear weapons capabilities. capabilities. It's time for us to be talking about moving towards a world free of nuclear weapons, and we actually have the self-interest to do so. This is not an ideological or a pie-in-the-sky vision. This is about moving towards a world that is safer for those states that already possess nuclear weapons. And this is possible if only we can actually open our minds to it.
Doug, I want to come back to the point you raised a few minutes ago about what happens if a new administration in the US, or under a new administration, the US becomes more isolationist. Would countries who are current signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty seek perhaps to build their own deterrent?
Well, that is a very interesting question. I mean, if you look at, for example, Japan vis-a-vis China, or South Korea vis-a-vis North Korea and potentially China, you know, if there was no U.S. nuclear umbrella, as we call it, what would they do? You know, it's hard to predict, but there's been interest, especially in South Korea, in nuclear weapons. 30 years ago, the father of the current president had a program going. The U.S. put a lot of pressure on President Park Chung-hee to shut it down, threatened basically to end the alliance if he didn't. So I think that this is one of those issues, again, existential threats. People look at their neighborhood. At the moment, countries are assuming the United States will defend them. If the U.S. decides it doesn't want to be mixed up in that, then I think you could see the interest change. And especially if you look at Northeast Asia, I think that's the most obvious question, because particularly of North Korea, that it's really upsetting the balance. You know, the estimates are it could make 5, 6 a year, perhaps. You know, we see no end to its potential ambitions. It's really, I think, a very untrustworthy regime. It's not suicidal. Nevertheless, it's not the kind of regime you want to rely upon. It's not the UK in terms of, you know, who do you think can handle these kinds of weapons? And that's going to be an issue for the next administration. And I think that's going to be a question for changing U.S. strategy, not just Donald Trump, but a strategy for a country that's heavily in debt, that really can't forever finance the defense of your wealthy allies. These pressures are going to be emerging in the coming years in the U.S. I think this will be a matter of discussion.
Grant, what do you make of that? Are there circumstances you could see that proliferation, in which proliferation could be a good thing? Could it help to promote stability in inherently unstable parts of the world?
So I personally completely disagree with any nuclear proliferation. I don't think the world would be better if more countries had nuclear weapons. I don't think the world would be safer if countries that currently have nuclear weapons develop new capabilities. Having said that, the argument has been made and advanced for a long time by a lot of eminent thinkers in the field. And then if you kind of go back to the domino thing I was talking about earlier, that, you know, Russia has them in response to the US, and then China has them in response to maybe both, and then India has them. So if you look at the countries that currently have nuclear weapons, then say who next, your list is actually pretty short. So there is some hope there, but absolutely I don't think that it would make the world more stable if Japan had nuclear weapons or South Korea.
Paul, we've got less than a minute left. I just want to give you one last word there. Do you want to pick up on what we're saying there? Can you, I mean, I know what you're going to say, but can you see any circumstances under which proliferation would be a good thing?
You don't know what I'm going to say, because what I'm going to say is that it is very fashionable, for very understandable, obvious reasons, to say that the world is unstable today. I mean, we're sitting in London where we've just voted to leave the European Union. We have a new cabinet and the official opposition is in disarray. Things look very uncertain. In the US, we have a possible President Trump. But I don't think there's any indication at all of a serious move towards isolationism within the United States. President Trump would have all sorts of uncertainty and scary aspects, but withdrawing from the world, no, I don't think so. I think what we have is a world where there is great uncertainty, but one of the great certainties is that the United States will always see an interest in trying to create stability and stable markets around the world. So I don't think there is any serious prospect of the US withdrawing from world politics.
All right. And there, I'm afraid, we must end our discussion. Many thanks, gentlemen, to you all. Paul Ingram, Doug Bandow and Grant Christopher. And as always, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website aljazeera.com, and for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. You'll find it at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the rest of the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.